This is Justin Ruiz for CSC300 Midterm Project. First, I'll begin by going over the website class. So the website class has 4 parameters to it, 2 strings, one called URL, one called name, and 2 ints, one called day visits and one called total visits. It has 2 constructors, one that takes 2 strings and one that takes a website object. First, the one that requires 2 strings. This is used for the initial creation from either the JSON or manual input methods, which I'll go over when we get there. All it does is set the string in the first parameter and the string in the second parameter to the newly created object's URL and name parameter accordingly. It initializes the day visits to 0 and initializes the total visits to a random integer between 10 and 20 as per the project prompt. Secondly, for the constructor that requires a object website, this constructor is used for hard cloning in the sorting method, which I'll go over when we get there. All it does is take a website object and create a new website object using that website object that was passed parameters. The website object also has a method called display, which basically just prints out all the parameters neatly. Now I'll go over the project as it goes through the lines. So it starts off in main, and the first thing that the program does is create a array of objects of websites to store and work with the data. So now we go into the file or input generation method, which also sets the site that's returned from that method into the sites that is created in main. So for the file or input generation method, the user will choose whether they want to generate data from a JSON or input it manually. So basically it just prompts them, and whatever integer they put in next in the scanner will be the choice that they choose depending on the prompt that is given to them. So if they choose 1, then they'll be grabbing from the JSON, and if they choose 2, they'll be manually inputting the websites themselves. So if the user chooses to grab the information from a JSON, it will go into the grab from JSON method. The method will search for a file in the source folder called data.json. The website array of sites will be created with a length of 20 as per the project prompt, and the scanner will scan the file, the JSON file. So in this for loop here, it goes from 0 to 20 because there's 20 lines in the JSON or 20 websites that need to be created. It'll read every line and set it to a string value. Then it'll set the JSON object based on the parameters given in the string. We need the URL parameter for creating the website object, and we need the name parameter as well so that we can place it into a constructor. This line right here puts the strings, the newly created strings, into a constructor so that the new website can be created, and then the website is then placed into the sites array. So I'll quickly click over to the JSON file that I used for testing this, and basically it's just 20 lines of different websites formatted as a JSON with parameters of URL, name, current day visit, and total visits. Lastly, the array of objects sites will be sent back to the file or input generation, which will then be sent back into the main. Now, if the user chooses to manually input the websites themselves, it'll go into the grab from user method. So this will do basically the same thing. It'll create a object array with length 20, and then it'll create a scanner, and then it'll prompt the user to enter 20 URLs and website names separated by a comma. So this for loop here goes from 0 to 20 because that's the number of websites we need. Then we use a string array to delimit the user inputs from the scanner by comma. And then we will use the constructor that uses the URL and the name parameters and place them into the array of objects called sites. And then lastly, the array of objects called sites will be sent back to compiler input generation will then send it back to main. So now that we have sent the array of objects back to main, the third line will sort the array of objects using the sort method that I've created. Basically, it's just a nested for loop that uses two temporary variables, and then it'll pump through the array one by one. And if the pointer finds a website where the total visits is more than the first pointer, then it will place those two websites into a temporary website object variable and then switch those two objects in the array itself, sorting it by total visit. So for the last portion of the project, the program will now simulate 5 days on the internet as per this for loop. And then the for loop will call the new day method 5 times. And in the new day method is where most of the work is done. So each call of the new day method will simulate 1 day on the internet. First, I have to initialize the visits to 0, and then I create a integer array called visited index with length of 20. And this is to keep track of websites that are visited on a per day basis. So now in the do while loop, we will generate an integer from 0 to 19, which is the first index in the object arrays and the last index of the object arrays. Then we save the random number, and if the site that is in that random integer's index, if that day visits is less than 3, then we can iterate 1 on their day visits. So we add 1 to the day visits, and in the index of the website, in the visited integer array, where we keep track of what website is visited per that day, we also add 1. And then we can also iterate the visits counter by 1 as well. And we use a do while loop here because if the random number generator attempts to visit a website more than 3 times, then it would be a problem for the for loop that will iterate the visits integer no matter what. But instead, we have this do while loop and an else condition here, so that in that case that we do try to visit that website more than 3 times, we just won't iterate the visits integer. So the do while loop will happen again as if nothing happened. So once the visits integer has reached 10, that means we visited our 10 websites for the day, but no website more than 3 times. And next, the for loop here will go through every index in the visited integer array, and in that visited index or integer array, if that number in that index is greater than 0, then that means that it was visited, as per the previous if statement here. And so if that's the case, then we can print out that website was visited, and then we print out the value of that number on that array's index. Next, there's a simple for loop here that will add all the day visits for that day into the total visits parameter for the website. And then the program will sort it once again based on total visits now that the total visits has been updated. And it will simply call the full display method here, which just calls all the websites' display method, but puts the rank number according to this for loop. Well, it's basically the rank number of the position in the array based on the index after it's been sorted. So lastly, there's just another for loop here that will set all the day visits back to 0 so that the method can return the sites back to main and loop again. Now I'll go ahead and run the project just to prove that it works. So it'll ask the user if they want to use JSON or manually input it. So for this case, I'll put 1, and it'll grab the JSON that was in the source file, in the source folder titled data. And here, so at the end of day 0, we visited 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 websites. 1 was visited twice and 1 was visited 3 times for a total of 10 visits. And then it'll rank all of them by total visits here. This is for day 0. Does the same thing for day 1. Each website was visited one time except for one, so 9 websites were visited for a total of 10 times, ranked by total visits, and prints out what the current day visit was for that day, sets it back to 0 at the end of day 2, and then does the same thing for 5 days as per the project prompt. Now, if the user decides that they want to manually input, they can as well. They just enter 2 here, and it will prompt them to enter 20 URLs and website names separated by a comma. So I can do that. And it will use the first value entered as the URL and the second value entered as the name of the website, and it basically does the same thing.